October 2009. The New England sky was a dreary gray, soaked in a bleak autumn rain that blurred the landscape and weighed heavily on the soul. At Boston's South Station, Amtrak train 174 from New York was slowly rolling to its final stop, the screech of metal on the tracks sounding like a weary sigh. Inside the cars, passengers began to stir, pulling suitcases from overhead racks, shrugging on coats, and preparing to merge into the city's bustling flow. But in car number 3, at seat 12A, there was an unusual silence. An elegant Burberry coat, a symbol of understated luxury, was still draped over the back of the seat. Beside it lay a hardcover novel titled The Secret History, its pages face down as if its owner had just stepped away to take a phone call. A paper cup of coffee from a high-end cafe in Penn Station was still warm to the touch. Everything was there, neat and orderly, except for one thing: the woman who owned them. Her name was Eleanor Vance. She had boarded the train, but she never got off. The first person to notice the anomaly was the conductor, a middle-aged man named Frank. As he walked down the aisle for a final check, he saw the empty seat with the personal belongings still intact. He vaguely remembered the woman who had sat there, a graceful, blonde lady. Perhaps she was in the restroom. Frank waited patiently. 5 minutes, then 10, passed. The car was nearly deserted. A vague sense of unease began to creep over him. He knocked on all the restroom doors in the car. No answer. He used his master key to open them. They were all empty. Frank reported it to the trainmaster. Together, they walked through the other cars, calling out the name Eleanor Vance, but no one responded. The confusion quickly turned into genuine alarm. A passenger couldn't just vanish from a moving train. They notified the station police in Boston. 2 officers arrived within minutes, their faces just as bewildered. They sealed off car number 3, treating it as a potential crime scene, though no one knew what crime had been committed. Between 2 major cities, on a steel machine hurtling forward at over 100 miles per hour, Eleanor Vance had disappeared. No one saw a thing. No one heard a thing. She had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind one of the most inexplicable mysteries the New York Police Department had ever faced. The case was quickly transferred to the NYPD, as Eleanor's point of departure was New York. The person assigned to lead the investigation was Detective Isabella Rossi, a veteran of the Special Victims Unit. Rossi, in her 40s, had thick black hair pulled back in a neat bun and a pair of discerning brown eyes that had seen through countless lies. She was known for her almost obsessive persistence and her ability to connect the smallest details that others overlooked. Partnering with her was Detective Dave Miller, a large, quiet man who served as a sounding board for Rossi's sometimes seemingly wild theories. "A woman disappears from a moving train?" Miller mumbled as they drove to the Vance residence in Greenwich, Connecticut. "Sounds like something out of a Hitchcock movie." "In Hitchcock's movies, Dave," Rossi replied, her eyes fixed on the initial case file. "We just haven't found it yet." The Vance mansion appeared like a fortress of wealth and refined taste. It stood on a tree-lined street with a perfectly manicured garden. The man who opened the door was Richard Vance. He was tall and classically handsome, with carefully styled salt and pepper hair and an expensive suit. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he held a glass of whiskey in his hand, even though it was only mid-afternoon. "Come in, detectives," he said, his voice hoarse. Inside, the house exuded a cold luxury, more like a showroom than a home. Richard recounted the story of that morning. Eleanor had a day trip to Boston for work. He had personally driven her to Penn Station. they kissed goodbye. He returned to his office in Manhattan and worked all day. "How was your marriage, Mr. Vance?" Rossi asked, her tone gentle, but the question direct. "Perfect," Richard answered almost immediately. We were everything to each other. Eleanor was my whole world." He raised a hand to cover his face, his shoulders shaking. Rossi watched him. His grief seemed genuine, yet there was something overly controlled about it, as if he were playing a well-rehearsed role. "Did she have any enemies? Anyone who might want to harm her?" Miller asked. "No, impossible," Richard shook his head. "Everyone loved Eleanor. She was the kindest person I've ever known." When the interview concluded, Rossi and Miller stepped back out into the chilly afternoon air. "What do you think?" Miller asked. "He said perfect too quickly," Rossi remarked. "No one has a perfect marriage. Only people who want others to think they do." The first 48 hours of the investigation were like fumbling in a pitch-black room. Rossi and her team worked relentlessly. They re-examined the security footage from all of the Amtrak 7-4 stops: New Haven, New London, Providence. For hours they watched grainy tapes, searching for a woman in a Burberry coat, but to no avail. Eleanor Vance did not appear to have set foot in any of those stations. They obtained the passenger manifest for car number 3 and began the interviews. Most people remembered nothing. They were absorbed in their books, laptops, or fitful naps. A college student recalled seeing an elegant woman walk toward the restroom, but he couldn't be sure it was Eleanor, nor could he remember if she had returned. An elderly couple sitting a few rows away said they hadn't heard any unusual noises, no arguments, no screams. "It's like a locked room mystery," Miller said during a team meeting, his face etched with frustration. "Except this room is hundreds of miles long and constantly moving." Meanwhile, Richard Vance's alibi was confirmed to be solid. His colleagues at the Manhattan Investment Fund verified that he had been in the office from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m., participating in several meetings and important calls. There was no window of time long enough for him to have gotten to one of the stations and harmed his wife. The media began to catch wind of the story. Wealthy art appraiser mysteriously vanishes from train. Sensational headlines started to appear. The pressure mounted on the investigative team. The case wasn't just bizarre, it was a public relations nightmare. Rossi felt she was hitting a dead end. Every logical path led to an invisible wall. She decided to temporarily set aside the question of how and focus on why. Why would a woman like Eleanor Vance disappear? 2 weeks passed. The case began to go cold, but Rossi didn't give up. She ordered her team to dig deeper into the Vances' lives. They started examining financial records and phone calls from the months leading up to Eleanor's disappearance. And slowly, cracks began to appear in the perfect picture. They spoke with Eleanor's best friend, a woman named Clara. At first, Clara was reserved, but after Rossi convinced her that silence wouldn't help find her friend, she opened up. They weren't perfect," Clara said, her eyes welling with tears. For the last few months, Eleanor had been very worried. She felt Richard was growing distant, hiding something. She started to suspect he was being unfaithful. Clara then revealed an even more critical detail. Eleanor, with the instinct of an appraiser who always sought the truth behind the facade, had begun to look into Richard's books herself. She told me the numbers didn't add up. She thought Richard might be in serious financial trouble. Just then, the breakthrough they had been waiting for arrived. A track maintenance worker, while walking along the rails in Queens, New York, discovered a cell phone with a cracked screen lying in the bushes. It was Eleanor's. The NYPD's digital forensics lab worked through the night to recover the data. What they found blew away any theory of a voluntary disappearance. There were tense text messages between Eleanor and Clara, in which Eleanor wrote, "I think I've figured it out. It's worse than I thought. I need to talk to my lawyer." And then there was a draft email never sent. The recipient was Eleanor's lawyer, who specialized in divorce and financial fraud. The subject line contained only 3 words: proof of financial fraud. The body of the email was empty, as if she had been interrupted before she could write more. "Now we have a motive," Rossi said in the briefing room, her face hardening. Eleanor discovered her husband was a cheat and a crook. She was about to expose him. The investigation now focused entirely on Richard Vance. Rossi's team began to tail him, scrutinizing his every move. They quickly discovered the other woman. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, a young, ambitious analyst who worked at Richard's firm. They had frequent lunches together, and there were long, late-night phone calls. Rossi and Miller went to see Sarah at her apartment. Sarah, a pretty redhead, looked terrified to see the police. She vehemently denied any relationship with Richard beyond their professional one. "He's my boss, that's all," she insisted, her hands nervously twisting together. "We have the phone records," Miller said, his voice low and steady. "Over 50 calls between you two outside of work hours in the last month, a few at 2 a.m. Those must have been some very urgent work discussions." Sarah's face went pale, her confidence crumbled. But she still didn't admit to anything. Her vehement denial only made Rossi more suspicious. An innocent person would be confused, but a guilty one would be excessively defensive. The problem remained Richard's alibi. It was still rock solid. How could he have done it? Rossi felt she was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle, one that could change the entire shape of the picture. In her frustration, Rossi did what good detectives often do when they're stuck. She went back to the beginning. That night, she sat alone in the department's dark screening room and had a technician play the CCTV footage from Penn Station on a large screen. She watched it over and over, dozens, then hundreds of times. The hasty kiss. Eleanor, or someone who looked like her, turning and walking away. She watched it at normal speed, then in slow motion. She zoomed in on the image. And then, after hours of staring at the grainy images, a strange feeling began to form. It wasn't a sudden eureka moment, but a slow, chilling realization. The woman on the tape had a slightly different walk than the one in old videos of Eleanor that Rossi had studied. Eleanor had a poised, confident gait. This woman seemed hurried, almost furtive. And then she saw it. The handbag. Clara had described Eleanor's favorite black Birkin bag in great detail. The bag the woman on the tape was carrying, while also black, had a completely different clasp. It was a small mistake, a careless detail that an imposter wouldn't notice, but that a best friend and a sharp-eyed detective would. "Dave," she called Miller at 3 a.m., "get down to the station. I don't think Eleanor Vance ever got on that train." The next day, they brought in a video analysis expert. Using specialized software to compare gait and biometric features, the expert confirmed Rossi's suspicion. The probability that these are two different people is extremely high, he concluded. A cold, cruel truth began to emerge. If Eleanor wasn't on the train, who was there? And where was the real Eleanor? With the new theory that the entire scene on the train was a staged performance, Rossi ordered a re-examination of all the evidence collected from seat 12A. This time, they weren't looking for signs of a struggle, but for signs of forgery. They focused on the book, The Secret History. Why this particular book? A quick investigation revealed that Eleanor had bought it just 2 days before she disappeared. It wasn't a long-time favorite, but a new prop. This further strengthened the theory of a setup. In the forensics lab, a technician noticed something odd. The spine of the book seemed slightly thicker than normal and showed traces of a very fine adhesive. He carefully used a scalpel to separate the layers of cardboard. And inside, hidden in a small, skillfully carved-out compartment, was a tiny USB drive. It was the silver bullet Rossi had been looking for. Plugging the USB into a computer, they found what Eleanor's draft email had hinted at: the complete records of Richard's shady transactions, offshore bank accounts, and proof that he had embezzled millions of dollars from his client's investment fund. Eleanor hadn't just discovered her husband's affair. She had discovered he was a major white-collar criminal. She had enough evidence to destroy him completely. Rossi and Miller arrested Richard Vance at his luxurious Manhattan office. This time, there was no pretense of grief, only cold arrogance. In the interrogation room, Richard remained silent, flanked by an expensive lawyer. Rossi began to speak, her voice steady, telling a story. She told the story of a man who had everything but greedily wanted more. She told of a smart wife who discovered her husband's secrets. Then she laid the comparative photos from the CCTV on the table. She laid down the video analyst's report. She laid down a printout of the financial records from the USB drive. We also spoke to Sarah, Rossi bluffed coolly. They were interrogating Sarah in another room at the same time. She was very cooperative. She told us everything about your plan. It was the final blow. The thought of being betrayed by his lover shattered Richard's composure. The confident facade crumbled. He looked at his lawyer, who just gave a slight shake of his head, but it was too late. Richard began to talk. His confession poured out like a broken dam. He recounted that fateful night. Eleanor had confronted him in his home office, presenting the evidence she had found. They had a furious argument. When Eleanor said she was going to call the police, Richard panicked. In a blind rage, he pushed her. Eleanor fell, hitting her head on the hard edge of the oak desk. She died instantly. In the dead silence of the house, Richard's panic turned into cold calculation. He knew he would lose everything. He hid his wife's body in the wine cellar, and then he devised an insane but sophisticated plan to create a mysterious disappearance. A case with no body and no crime scene. He called Sarah, using love and promises of a future together to draw her into his scheme. He staged everything, from buying the train ticket to having her impersonate Eleanor to throwing the phone from the train. He had almost succeeded. Based on Richard's confession, the police found Eleanor Vance's body buried under the floor of the wine cellar in her own home. Richard Vance was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder. Sarah Jenkins, for her role as an accomplice, also received a lengthy prison sentence. Richard's financial empire collapsed in a massive scandal. The case was closed, but its echoes lingered. It became a cautionary tale about the dark secrets that can hide behind the closed doors of the most seemingly perfect families. A few months later, when Eleanor's personal effects were returned to her family, her younger sister found something in a desk drawer. It was a one-way plane ticket to London, booked for October 16th, the day after she disappeared on the fateful train she never boarded. Perhaps Eleanor knew she was in danger. She had been preparing her own escape, a new life somewhere far away. But tragically, she never got the chance to use it. The train of her life had stopped at a station she never chose.